I have started by using masking fluid and frisket to block out my hawks themselves, and then I'm going to be using Createx airbrush paint to airbrush my background, which saves so much time. The goal here when getting a blurry background, or the main trick I should say, is just to not put a lot of teeny tiny little detail. You can have a lot of little things going on, you just don't want sharp detail. So everything stays fairly soft. I keep the airbrush pretty far away from that paper as I work. What I like to do when I'm figuring out what I want to do for my backgrounds when I do a blurry background is I find the image that I like and then I put a Gaussian or Gaussian, and I'm totally saying that wrong, blur in Photoshop on it so that I know what it looks like. I don't just imagine what that image would look like blurry because it would never come out right. So by making it blurry in Photoshop, I have a decent reference photo then of what I want that background to look like. You can see as I come on top with the brown tones, I'm layering it over the green tones. I'm not trying to stay within the line or keep anything clean at all. And this is just a layering process, and you'll see it looks pretty terrible. I mean, early on. It looks like something that somebody who's never touched an airbrush before has done. And that's normal. You're just going to keep layering on top of layer until you get your background how you want. The thing that I like with the Createx paints is a lot of them are fairly opaque, so it's pretty forgiving if I mess something up. The Art paint, which is also another one that's really good, that one is not as forgiving though because they're so translucent, which can be great for building up depth, but I don't like it that much either because it has a bit more shine to it than the Art. But I do have to add a pretty good amount of water in with the Art paint in order to get it to feed through the airbrush because it's really, really thick. If you're new to the airbrush, I do recommend watching my intro to airbrushing and painting flames video. Even if you don't want to paint flames, the beginning gives you some tips on how to keep your airbrush clean and hopefully keep it from clogging too badly if you are using Createx like I am. The Art doesn't clog the airbrush very bad at all, which is nice. Almost never. Createx is another story, but I like the finished result, so. And I had too much water mixing with my paint there, and so I got a little bit of a smudge, so I'll have to go over that little dot with some more paint to cover it up. I find that the Art paint because it's so translucent, it is so hard to hide a mistake, because even if you cover it up with opaque paint, you can always tell that it looks different than whatever you had in the background. So with that stuff, you have to be a lot more careful. Now the color that I've got in my airbrush right now is black and brown, which is pretty flat, and so I will end up going over that with green again once that dries. This background can be done just with colored pencil, but it would have probably taken me, I'd say, 3 days to get that much paper covered, because it's a pretty big piece. Whereas with airbrush, I probably spent maybe an hour on it, if that. Now in between colors, I am running water through the airbrush and occasionally the airbrush cleaner made by Createx, but normally I just run water through it real well and just to clean out whatever the previous color was. I keep a spray bottle and use that to spray the dirty paint out so that I don't have to take it to the bathroom or to a sink every single time to clean. I just spray the water out of the spray bottle into the barrel of the airbrush gun upside down so it kind of cleans out into my container full of water that I always have next to me, and then run water straight through the gun itself. And then on to my next color. And when I'm done painting for the day, I do the same thing, but I always run a lot of the airbrush cleaner through it. Otherwise, when I go to paint the next time, the whole airbrush will be quite clogged. So you can see there's a lot of busyness going on, but it's very, very soft. No sharp, sharp details. Now once I finished up with getting most of the busyness done, I went over it with the white paint all over the entire bottom, all the green, the black, everything, just to soften everything up, which would mean the hawks later on, once I got those in, that it would push them forward quite a bit. Right now, my contrast is too sharp for the look that I was going for. So I didn't want it to fight with the birds. So I needed to soften all that up, and just by lightly going over it with the white airbrush paint, that fixed it. So here you can see I've gone over it with green first. And by putting green over everything, it kind of pushes everything together so that I don't have too many separate colors all over the place. There are colors, but it just pushes everything back. Bit more with the white, and anytime now I should be going over all of that with the white just to soften everything up. Although I'm starting to wonder if I caught that on camera or if I had turned it off for that portion. The reason you keep seeing me touch the canvas is I'm making sure that the paint is dry. Because I use water on it, if I keep adding wet paint on top of wet paint, it will start to run. There I go with creating that foggy, fuzzy look. That is just white over everything. That's it for my background. So now on to the colored pencil. So I am drawing out feather by feather. And I've got to clean up the edges. You can see that those edges are really pretty harsh on that wing especially. So I will come back through with blue that matches my sky in between those feathers just to clean them up. Sorry about the lines going through the screen there. That's my video or my camera, not your computer. That should stop soon. So for the most part, I'm using the Polychromos for the feathers because there's so much tiny, tiny detail here. These birds are actually pretty small considering I'm doing the entire body, so I can't get as much detail as I normally would when I do a bird. So I've got to find a way to create the look of feathers, get detail, but not as much detail as I normally can. So the Polychromos were definitely a good choice on a lot of the little areas. I switched over to the Luminance when I wanted certain grays and tans because Luminance colors, or the Luminance colored pencils, make some of the best gray and tan colors. But other than that, I preferred my Polychromos. I'm using a really small paintbrush. This is still a Taklon filbert paintbrush. I'm sorry, a Taklon bristled paintbrush, but a really small one for some of these little feathers. So I'm keeping my edges really, really sharp. A lot of times, depending on what I'm doing, I will try to soften out my edges, but here I wanted the birds to really look like they just pop out of that background. And so I wanted those edges really harsh. So I go over them several times just to make sure that that area is really clean. Now, if the birds had a lot of white on them, I would let the white kind of fade into the blue in the background. But because I've got such a dark color here, I want to go ahead and sharpen that up. And that's not to say anytime I'm doing a white area, I would let that fade out. It just depends on what the background is. If I've got a pale area against a pale area in the background, I will let that be soft intentionally. I'm not going to come through and try to outline it. But if I've got high contrast, a dark area up against a light area or a light area up against a dark area, that I'm going to sharpen and let be strong and harsh. It's like that hermit crab on my desk just knows when I'm recording because he starts climbing around and making all kinds of noise. I think he wants your guys' attention. You'll notice when I add color with the Luminance pencil, it's very fuzzy. I don't get as sharp of a line as I do with the oil-based Polychromos. And that's one of the reasons on this area that has so much detail, I really prefer the Polychromos. You can see for the most part, I'm breaking this up feather by feather. If I try to just get a base coat or a base gray for all of the feathers, I'm going to lose my place and it's going to get really overwhelming. So if I can kind of block them out, that'll make it easier. The other thing that I'm doing a lot is counting feathers. I'm comparing to my reference photo and counting, okay, 6 feathers down, that's the one that I'm working on. Stuff like that to keep my place. So there are a lot of feathers. So I'm blocking in the darker shadows first on those feathers. Again with the Polychromos pencil. And I needed to keep everything so sharp on this piece because of all the tiny detail, so I have my sandpaper that I was constantly using to sharpen up the point on those pencils. Now that that is blocked in, I am blending that out with paint thinner, and I can be pretty messy here because I've got the dark. I'm not going to lose those black lines. The black from the Polychromos colored pencil will always be black in those areas now. So I don't have to blend out each feather individually. But now that that's blocked in, once that dries, now it's time to start cleaning those feathers up. What I usually do, well, one area, just to make sure it's dry all the way, because here I used so much paint thinner that it takes a little bit longer to dry. If I don't have a whole lot of paint thinner on my brush, it will be dry almost instantly and I can go right away on top of it. But here I was being very sloppy because it didn't matter if I had a lot of paint thinner on the brush, but it takes a little bit longer to dry. So while one area dries, I will go work on another area and then go back to the first area after it's ready. As I was working on these feathers, I really wished that I was working larger. Larger wouldn't have fit on my board, which is, I worked on a piece as big as I had a board for. But that is something that I think that I'm going to invest in, just get some MDF board from the hardware in a larger size, because I couldn't get the detail quite as sharp as I would have liked to if I was working larger. Now on this piece, my contrast isn't as high as I normally go on a lot of the animals that you see me do, because this photo is taken midday, like at noon type thing, where it is just such strong sunlight everywhere. So you're not having that high contrast shadow on one side or another. So I've got to make sure that the details are sharp, because I can't depend on those shadows to really create the depth that I want. So now when I go through the paint thinner, you can see I'm working each individual feather now that I've better defined my lights and my darks. I'm not just washing over all of it because I don't want to blur that up. The first layer, it didn't matter. So I'm just defining the feathers on the dry portion of the paper now. Now for something like this, I'm pretty much going for close. I don't need each single feather on that, where they're tiny feathers, to be exact. I just need to create the right movement of the feathers so they're going in the right direction and they're dark where they should be and light where they should be. But trying to do each teeny tiny individual feather would kind of be a waste of time, because it wouldn't make it look any better. So I don't want to waste a lot of time worrying about that sort of thing, as long as they're close at that point. But that doesn't mean that you can start being lazy and putting random lines all over the place, because that's not the case either, especially when you're first starting out. I do recommend try to copy as close as possible, but don't freak out if you're missing a feather. No one's going to notice the difference as long as you're pretty close. So at this point, I'm just defining the feathers on that portion of the wing better. Now I'm not just outlining them, I'm adding the darks where the darks go and the lights where the lights go. It looks like I've just outlined them, but in that case, those feathers are darker on that portion. So you still want to, don't get lazy and start randomly, just outlining all of your feathers. That won't look right. Pay attention to your specific reference photo. And in this case, these guys have a lot of their feathers that are highlighted on the outer edge, so it looks like I've just been lazy and outlined them. That really is how these feathers should be. Again, notice how very, very sharp that pencil is. Now, once I had all of those lined, I, with a very light hand, went over with my reddish brown tone right over everything. I used more pressure for the outlines so that I wouldn't lose those, and then very, very lightly went over that whole section. As I worked on this piece, I jumped around a lot more than normal. At one point, when I was working on the other hawk, I would come back and do touch-ups on this wing as I looked away from it. Once I took that time away from being focused on such a tiny area for so long, I would come back and see more stuff that I wanted to adjust. A lot of that didn't get captured on camera, but I just kept layering and layering and layering. And the nice thing is, because I continuously worked with a very light hand, I was able to pretty much do unlimited layering. Sometimes if you look at any single area for too long, you just start to lose sight of what it is you're doing. You stop noticing little things. Now here, that whole undersection of the wing right here, that's that reddish brown, I think it would have been a lot easier for me had I broken it up into 2 or 3 sections instead of doing that whole section kind of in one shot. I think I should have taken my own advice here, because I started to lose what I was doing and had to keep stopping and coming back later. But had I just done the upper section and then the mid section and then the section closest to the body, I think it would have been a lot easier to keep track of what it was I was doing. I layered some of that reddish brown color into the feathers, or the flight feathers. Now, if you look close at the flight feathers, you will see some lines in there. The feathers themselves aren't perfectly smooth. I do want lines in there, but I have to make sure that those lines go the right direction. And I'm pointing at the screen, and that is not helping you guys at all. But not just the outline of the feather themselves, and I'm talking about the flight feathers right now, but there's vertical lines that continuously go through all of those feathers. I left those in there intentionally because if you look closely at a bird's feather, there are those little lines in there. There are basically a lot of little hairs that are kind of all stuck together to create one feather. So if you're drawing birds and you haven't already, go to the art store and pick up, they have feathers there that you can look at closely, especially the flight feathers. Look at how those are put together. It'll make it a lot easier to notice that sort of thing when you're drawing your own birds. So now I don't have a lot of paint thinner on my brush because I'm just lightly smudging what's already there. I just want to hit those top layers of colored pencil. So now that that's dry, I can come on top with lighter colors and start better defining those little feathers. And drawing the detail isn't enough. If you just draw the lines, it's going to look very flat. I've got to get my highlights in there. I'm using an ink eraser right now to pull some of that colored pencil up. That ink eraser, it's by Faber-Castell. The one available in the US has a cream colored case with a little black brush at the end. But I'm lifting up a bit of that colored pencil so that I can come back on top with the lights. What was happening was that the lighter colors I was trying to add in here weren't really sticking well to the paper. So by lifting some of that up, I can then come on top again. And on my recent colored pencil supply list, there is in the video description a link to that eraser. It's definitely on my must-have list for colored pencil now. I didn't even know it existed, but one of my viewers from Mexico sent me some to try out. Oh, they're amazing. So much better than the electric eraser I was using for colored pencil. So now where I want the light areas to really show up, I've switched over to my Luminance, which are a more opaque pencil. Normally with colored pencil, the amount of time that it takes me to do an area is only has to do with the size of the area I'm working on. And I found on these wings, trying to get all of this little teeny tiny stuff in there, I spent longer than I think I would have had that wing been twice the size. It's so much easier to work larger, at least with this much detail. And as you're working, if your work looks flat or unrealistic, just keep layering. As long as your outline is there, you can keep layering and layering and layering until it looks right, until you get the depth and the dimension that you're going for. Remember, on all of mine, I usually have 15 to 20 layers, sometimes more. You can see I'm back over to those flight feathers now. Pulling out some highlights there. Now, the wing that I just did, even though I'm moving on, I am not finished with that wing, not even close. But I've looked at it for so long, I just need to move on to the next area. I'll come back and add little touch-ups and little details as I work. The nice thing with colored pencil is that you can really work on any area that interests you at that moment. It's not like one area is going to dry and it's going to mess up because you haven't worked on the other area first. Like with painting, we generally want to work with whatever is farthest back and move our way forward. With colored pencil, we don't have to do that. If you feel like working on the foreground first and doing the background later, you absolutely can. I usually tell students, though, to do their backgrounds first because it's so easy to do the foreground and then not want to put a lot of time and effort into the background. They kind of skip over it, which ruins the whole piece. So I normally will tell people to work on to do the background first. Now here, I chose to work on these wings first because they were the upper left-hand corner of the page, and being that I'm right-handed, I wouldn't be dragging my hand as much across something that was finished. I could, though, use glassine under my hand, which I do a lot on this piece. If I wanted to work on the other hawk first, I could just put glassine over him to protect him. And glassine is a roll of acid-free, it's kind of like wax paper almost, that the colored pencil won't stick to or cause any smudging, so you can use that to protect your hand as you work. But anyway, the point of all of that was you can choose to work on whichever part you really want to. I like to get my least favorite parts out of the way first, which is generally going to be the background. Otherwise, I know I will rush over that background once I've got the foreground finished. So I'm blocking in the darkest portions first of these feathers. Again, doing a lot of counting my reference photo to this are the feathers on the wing to make sure that I keep my place well. So I'm using violet gray, which is one of my favorite colored pencils. I go through that one, I think, as much as I do with the white. That one is by Luminance. I have used it on every single colored pencil piece that I've done since I got the Luminance pencils. It's just such a nice, natural, it's all kind of a purpley gray color. Now I've got a deeper, kind of a navy blue, the darkest blue I washed over that, and now blending that out with a paint thinner. You can see the edges on those feathers are a little bit fuzzy. I will come back through and define those better. While that dries, I go back to the other wing, adding more highlights, and you can see I'm getting more of those vertical lines I was talking about in the feathers. Adding purple on top of some of these feathers. I hear a lot from people they're not able to get their colored pencil to blend out quite like mine does. And usually that is caused because they don't have enough colored pencil on the paper. I do a lot of light layers, like 3 to 5 light layers before I blend with paint thinner. And then after I blend, I let it dry and then add 3 to 5 more layers. I mean, it's a layering process. You just keep layering and layering and layering until it looks good. This is one of the slowest mediums that you can work in, so don't expect it to quickly look good. It won't. And that white luminance, you can see it shows up so well against the dark background that I first put on there. It doesn't go completely white. If I needed something to stay really white, I would have put the white luminance first. But here, it just brings out really nice highlights. So if you're only working with Polychromos, strongly recommend at least pick up a white luminance pencil. They're available open stock. I actually got my first few white colored white luminance pencils from Amazon to try out so that I didn't have to pay shipping through Dick Blick or anything like that because I was placing such a small order. But that pencil is amazing for pulling back out highlights. So here's another area where there's tons and tons of tiny, tiny feathers. I am not going to sit there and put in all those little feathers because I don't think it's going to make a big difference to the viewer. I just need to create the hint of where those feathers go. So I'm blocking in kind of a mottled look. I'm getting this dotted effect. First, getting my background color blocked in. I blend that out with paint thinner. While that dries, I'm adding more work over on the other wing. I used my black Polychromos more on this piece than I have in a very long time. I think I used it more than I did on the black leopard. So now that the reddish brown part is dry, I'm adding more on top of that to get rid of the grainy crayon look that I currently have. I'm using shades of gold, red, and a terracotta type brown. Blending that out again with the paint thinner. And while that dries, back over to the flight feathers. And as I'm getting to these final layers on those flight feathers, I do not have very much paint thinner on that brush. Now I'm using a cream color. I want to say that's titanium buff. I can't remember. I call it cream because that's what color it looks like to me. But I'm lining and better defining some of those feathers now. And you can see that color shows up really well against the darks that I already have on there. So I'm lining where those go. And those feathers do have an outline of this light color. Not all birds are going to have that, so on many birds it would look completely wrong to be outlining the feathers the way that I'm doing now. So I'm paying attention to my reference photo on the direction that these feathers go, but I'm not worrying about making sure every single feather is in the exact right spot. So once I have those lined, I can come back in between some of those and add my lights and my darks. I started with the black lines that go through some of those feathers at the base. And then I apparently walked away and left the video camera going. There I am. And now I'm coming back through with those darker reddish brown colors in between some of where I had outlined with that cream color for those feathers. So I've got that very mottled look. Remember, when you're doing feathers, it's not just about drawing in little half circles or little loops that you think look like feathers. You want to copy your reference photo. Pay attention to the movement and the direction that those go and the size of all those little details. So I'll let that dry. I'm working on the next section down. And that wing isn't finished at all. Like the first wing, I'll keep coming back to it and making adjustments. You can see now that I've zoomed in, all of those areas are so rough. The wings that I've done previously, all that has to be smoothed out and blended out. So I will go back through later on and define that better. But being as small as these are, I'm not going to have the same amount of detail that I normally would in the eye, where I'd have the little lines going through it and the detail in the iris. I have to keep that pencil really sharp. Now this is one area I do not like how it photographed. Well, if I zoom in on the photograph, it looks fine. But the photograph that I posted on Facebook, it looks like the beak just blends in with the rest of the face. When you see it in person, it doesn't look like that. But because they're so tiny, it's really hard to see when I've shrunk the image down. Normally when things are shrunk down, I think they look better. But in this case, because it's just such tiny detail, you really can't get the full feel for it on that photo. It's funny, as I'm watching this, I keep looking at my project is actually sitting right next to me right now. And so I'm looking at this, picking it apart, all the little things that need to be fixed, things that need to be blended out and smoothed, and thinking, oh my gosh, this is terrible. I need to go fix that. I did go back and fix most of that. It's just kind of funny watching this here at this stage. And you guys really needed to know that. That pencil should be sharper than what it is right now. It would have made it much easier for me. Using my violet gray again for my base there. Now here I want to really define that edge of his head. Using a small brush with my paint thinner here. Notice I'm working around the eyes. I don't want to just wash over everything and lose that detail because it's so tiny it would be really hard to get that back in there. I think this is a good point to, or stage to point out how bad mine look as I work. And it's so obvious being that I'm zoomed in as close as I am. They don't start out looking good, ever. That you have to go through these ugly stages before you're going to get to those good stages where everything is blended smooth and all nice and pretty. But look how rough this looks. You just want to keep blending and layering. I see people get to this stage and give up or stop thinking, oh, I'm not good at colored pencil. Well, no, you're just not finishing your work. Keep layering. I guess that really goes for most mediums. Colored pencil is just a little bit harder or more frustrating, I think, for some people because it is such a slow process. And if you're not familiar with these ugly stages that you have to go through, it can be a little bit discouraging. I'm starting to build up the direction that these feathers need to go. Now watch how you hold your colored pencils too. I see some times where people work and their hand is all the way up, pretty much touching the lead of the pencil. If you're that far up on that pencil, you can't see the details that you're doing. Back your hand up a bit. You just don't have the control that you need if you're holding your hand too close. It's the same with painting. You don't want your hand right up near the bristles. It may seem like you have more control that way, but it's actually doing the opposite for you. When you're first starting with colored pencil, I don't actually recommend starting with the full body like this. It can be pretty intimidating. There's lots of words I could use there. But it's easier if you can start out with a close-up of a face, a close-up of an eye, something like that. It's a lot easier to tackle that way. Get used to doing that before you try doing the full body. I think the main thing there is just that the full body takes up so much more space. So you're either going to have to draw it really small so you can't get the detail, or you're going to have to do a piece that's so big that it's going to take you a year to finish. So starting with smaller studies can definitely make your experience go much smoother. You can see I'm using a fairly large brush for the area that I'm working on. I'm used to working with paintbrushes. If you are not, you can use a smaller brush. Don't feel like you need to use the same size that I'm using. Make it easier on yourself. Here, back to that white Luminance, and that is sharpened with the sandpaper, so the tip on the pencil looks really short, but it is quite sharp. Just like everywhere else, I've got to pay close attention to the direction of those feathers. You just start putting them randomly all over the place, it is going to look terrible. And I appear to have walked away from the canvas again, or paper, whatever it is that I'm working on. And back. Now notice these different colors that I'm adding in here. I've got purples, I've got this reddish brown, I've got grays, tons of colors in here. Don't be afraid to add extra colors. And I'm using, when I'm trying to decide which color that I want, I use the Photoshop, the eyedropper tool, to judge what color I'm actually seeing. Because sometimes I know it can be hard to think that purple should go in a certain area, or magenta. It can seem scary. But that eyedropper tool makes it really easy to see the different values and different colors in there. Now, I do tend to hype mine up a little bit more, but it gives me a good idea of where to start. And I've done videos showing you guys how I do that. If you just do a search on YouTube, search for La Cree and Photoshop, one of those videos will come up showing you exactly how I'm doing that. So I'm not finished with the head, but I'm moving on to the body now. I will go back and add more details to the head, just like I will for the wings. Every time you see me hold the pencil up to the paper and stop, I'm pausing and looking at my reference photo and judging, okay, the black comes out. If I go straight up, it should hit this feather on the wing. I'm judging my work against itself, because the drawings, the outline, if you're tracing something like I did here, it's only going to do so much for you. It's still going to be really easy to lose your place. And most of the lines on here, once I started working, I had no idea what most of these went towards. So it wasn't as big of a time saver as it sometimes is, but I have to constantly, every time you see that pause where I'm just holding the pencil still on the paper, I'm lining things up. At this point, if I go straight up, it should match up with a feather here or a feather there, that sort of thing. I think I've said that sort of thing way too many times on this video. I'm going to have to remove that from my vocabulary for the next week. I appear to be developing a bad habit. Now that I've blocked in my general lights and darks, and these are still pretty far off, I've blended that out with paint thinner. I've got to let that dry. I still had a bit of masking fluid on there that I used my nail just to scrape off. Layering some purple over that and blending that out. And you can see once the paint thinner dries, a lot of those colors come out very, very flat. When that happens, if I lose the richness in the color, I just need to do more layers. Here it didn't matter, I just needed a base color. So I could leave it pretty flat. Now, had I burnished that purple for the background there on his body, if I had burnished that and flattened the tooth out of the paper, when I came back through with the white for the little feathers, they would not have shown up, though. It wouldn't be able to really stick to the paper because I would have damaged the tooth. So by blending with the paint thinner, I'm able to come back through with the white, and the white shows up so well because it sticks so well. And again, that is the Luminance white. I don't bother with the Polychromos white at all. Again, notice how sharp that pencil is. I'm coming back through now and better defining the feathers on the head. And again, back to that white. You can see it's very, very sharp, and it shows up so well against that background. That background was not completely dry. The pencil wouldn't really stick to the paper well. So that's also a good hint on whether or not your paint thinner has dried. And the dry time will be dependent on two things. One, that, well, it'll be dependent on a few things, but one, the main thing would be the type of paper you're using. Stonehenge, I find that it soaks up the paint thinner more, and so it takes longer to dry. And the other thing would be how much paint thinner you've added on your brush. And again, not all birds are going to have these white borders on their feathers. This specific type of bird does. But there are several birds that if I had done the feathers looking like that, it would be completely wrong. These guys are pretty fancy though, and have outlines or these little frilly borders on their feathers. I found that the gold tones with the Polychromos, I needed to have those on there more solid. If you look at the leg there, look at how mottled that color looks on the upper section of the leg, the gold tone, the lightest color there. So with that, I really found I had to pay a little bit more attention in making sure I've got a lot of the colored pencil on the paper before I blended to avoid that. Here I can come back through, I'll put more layers to fix it, but it would have been easier in the first place with that specific color had I put more layers on the paper before I blended. And again, here, the same thing. If I don't have enough on there, and I'm going to have a mottled look again. So I'm putting the white down anywhere where I need to stay really white. I have put that white down, and I actually burnished the white. So when I blend the other colors, you can see they're not sticking to the area that the white was burnished over. It works so well at protecting the paper. And that is actually one thing you can use the Polychromos white with. It doesn't work as good, but it's really the only use I've found besides burnishing, almost using it like a colorless blender. But if you put it down first, it'll help you to keep your colors lighter. And as that head, as it started to come together, the feathers on his face, if you back this video up, go back to where it looked at the beginning, just to remind yourself that it's normal for things to look absolutely terrible when you start off. It's one of the best examples I've done in a long time of that, where you could really, really see how horrible it looked when it started. And you just keep layering and layering and layering until it starts to smooth out. Using that Polychromos that is very sharp to add in some of the details on the tail feathers. And there I had an area that needed to be really white, but I had gone too dark with the grays and the blues. So I used the ink eraser, pulled some of that colored pencil off, and then went on top of it with the Luminance white, and it really pulled the white back out. So I'm blending that out with the paint thinner, which smooths everything out so nicely. Now while that dries, I'm going to work on the feet. And I've got this gold yellow color that I put down. Then I'm using a gray brown color. Yeah, I'm making these names up, by the way. The actual names of the pencils that I used are listed in the video description. But that's as much help as I can give you, because I don't actually look at what the names are on the pencils as I'm working. And I need the edges of these feet to be super, super sharp in order to get that three-dimensional look that I'm going for. I ended up pulling a little bit more of that orange or kind of pumpkin color out on the feet than there was on the reference photo, just to make sure that it popped against the green more. I'm layering a brighter yellow on top of everything I had. And that kind of works like a glaze in paint. You can still see what's underneath it. I'm just tinting the color. I'm using a very small round brush there to blend that out with the paint thinner. I'm sharpening up my edges so that they really stand out against the background. You can't really tell here, but I am letting that paint thinner dry in between going back over it with the colored pencil. I'm using the Luminance pencil to pull out some highlights. That's that cream color that I was talking about earlier. So I'm leaving that bird alone for now. He's not completely finished. I'm going to continuously go back and do touch-ups, which will not be on camera, but they're such tiny touch-ups that you won't even notice. You wouldn't really be able to tell what I'm doing, just that the pencil's moving around. But moving on to the next bird. The paper under my hand there, again, is that glassine. Love that stuff. And I'm starting with the tail just because it's the upper left-hand corner of this bird. Being that I'm right-handed, it means my hand will drag across it less. So often when you're working on pretty much any subject, it's easier to sometimes think of things as being abstract shapes instead of, in this case, drawing a bird's tail. That doesn't look like a tail at all, but because of the angle of the tail and the photograph, that really is what it's supposed to look like. So if in my mind I was so set on I'm drawing a tail, it wouldn't have looked right. So here, again, look at it as abstract shapes. Really look at your reference photo. And drawing upside down can sometimes be the easiest way to do that. And apparently I left the camera again. Oh, I'm back. That is a very sharp pencil. I guess I was just sharpening pencils then. And the sharpener that I normally use for both my Polychromos and my Luminance pencils is the Comb sharpener. I've listed it in the colored pencil supply list video. It's really inexpensive and it works really well for both of those pencils. I have an electric sharpener, but I don't normally use it for anything but my Polychrome, or then the Prismacolors when I do comparison videos with those. Because the Polychromos and the Luminance don't ever break, I can use these cheap handheld sharpeners and they work just fine. So I'm first blocking in the shapes of the feathers here. And again, I mean, if you look at that, look how it looks like an abstract if you just zoomed in on that section. They don't look like feathers at all. And they shouldn't at this point. Back to counting feathers again, like I was talking about earlier. So I'm doing it a few feathers at a time before I blend out with the paint thinner, but I do recommend if you're just starting out, try to do one feather at a time. It is so much easier to manage. Takes a little longer, I think, that way, but it does make it a little bit easier to handle. Using that round Taklon bristled brush again to blend out. That is the little guy. And the word Taklon is just the type of bristles in the brush. It's a synthetic brush and very inexpensive. You don't need expensive brushes for this. Nothing is happening. There I am. So now with these feathers, they have such dark border outlines that I'm going through with the Polychromos and doing that first. And apparently I need to adjust the angle of the camera because I am working off screen. That's super helpful for you guys. You're welcome. You can see how much blue I actually have mixed in with these blues and purples. And when someone initially looks at the piece, they don't necessarily look at it and go, oh, those are blue feathers. It's just that subtle, subtle hint. But it gives a lot more depth to the piece than if had I just used grays and blacks. Being very messy with the paint thinner. I'm going right across 3 or 4 feathers at a time there. Once I get more detail blocked in, then I'll be more careful and only blend each individual feather. But for my base layers, it doesn't really matter. I just want to get the lead dissolved into the paper. Remember, when you're working with colored pencil, it is always better to start lighter than you think you're going to need to go and slowly darken up than to go too dark and not be able to easily lighten it back up. And I left again. And if you want to draw these hawks yourself or paint them, this photo is available over at wildlifereferencephotos.com. I changed my background, but the hawks are the same. I always like to change my background so that it doesn't look exactly like everybody else's. And it makes it a bit more unique and individual to me. Anytime that I use somebody else's reference photo, I do that. It is so rare that I leave the background as it is. Now this area looks kind of flat. The way that the light is hitting it, there isn't a lot of contrast like I get in some of the other areas of the wing. I've got that magenta type color mixed in there, and on all of these lighter feathers I'm going to have a varying shades of browns, kind of that reddish terracotta red brown color, purples, blues, and so many different tones of grays. Again, the reason that you'll see me use so many of the Luminance colors when I'm doing the grays is they just have such a good selection. So while sometimes I choose Luminance over Polychromos just based on how much transparency or how opaque I want a color to be, sometimes it's just because one brand will have better colors for the specific thing that I'm doing. Realistically, you can get just with one set something that looks almost exactly like what I've done, either whether it be just the Polychromos or just the Luminance or even Prismacolor if that's what you're working on. It's harder, and I do recommend with Polychromos, get at least the Luminance white. But you don't have to have both sets to get something to look like this. But it does make life a lot easier. Now notice on the back portion of the wing where it starts to get a lot darker, how I've got it left outlined with white. I need highlights there, and so it's easier for me to let the white paper show through. I'll soften it down a little later, but it's easier just to let that paper show through so I can make sure that that stays very light. While that portion of the wing dries from the paint thinner, I am working on the next group of feathers. Notice that I'm leaving white where I want my highlights to be on those feathers there. I'm not going to leave it that light, but it's easier to leave it extra white now than to try to lighten it up if I go too dark, because I do need bright highlights on part of that. Now right now, even the lighter feathers are a lot darker than I'm going to want to go, but I've got to get them dark first so that when I come on top with the light colors, the white luminance, that white will stand out more. You can see right now it looks very, very flat. But when I come back through with the white, that'll fix that up. So a lot of it is just experience and knowing what your layering process is going to be. In this case, I know I'm going to come back through with white, so I know that it's okay that it looks like this right now. But when you're first starting out, it can definitely be pretty scary to see it look like this and go, oh my gosh, I ruined it. I should just start over. Don't. Just keep layering. I recommend whenever possible, even if you get to a stage where you think it's terrible and that you should start over, that you finish the piece. Because if nothing else, you're going to learn more from it that way. But so often, it doesn't need to be started over. You just need to finish it. I'd say in art in general, the biggest problem that I see with newer artists' work, or heck, I even see it with more experienced artists, but the biggest problem is that they finish their piece, or they call it finished, way before it's finished. Like a quarter of the way through, they're saying that it's done, and it's not even close to being done. It's not that it's bad, it's just not finished. Spend the extra time until you get it to look how you want it to look. I also recommend starting out smaller. Don't try tackling a giant canvas or a giant paper, because it takes a lot longer. But if you do something smaller, it's not as big of a deal to take the time to finish it, even if it doesn't end up looking good, than if you had done a big paper or a big canvas and it's going to take you months and months and months. Do smaller projects like these. I usually do 11 by 14 inch for people who are starting out, for whether it be painting or with colored pencil. Actually, with colored pencil, a lot of times I do 8 by 10s, but don't go too big. This is big enough that you can get the detail that you want, but not so big that it's going to take you, hopefully won't take you, months and months to finish. Sometimes when you work on these bigger projects, you can really burn out, especially when you're going through so many ugly layers, which we all have in all of our work. So you can see I'm coming on top with the Luminance, those lighter colors, which would not have shown up had I not gotten the darks dark enough first. So it's a little backwards in this section from what I normally tell you, because I'm normally saying start light and work your way to darker. But here I knew that I needed it to be dark to get the look that I wanted with the lighter pencils. They do recommend have a scratch piece of paper of whatever you're working on. So in this case, if you're working on the Fabriano Artistico, have a scratch piece of the Fabriano Artistico next to you. And try out 1 or 2 feathers. See how it looks when you layer colors a certain way before you do it on your project. You can see what a difference these feathers, how much difference it makes, the more colors and the more layers that I'm adding here. Huge, huge difference from where it started off. Had I only used gray though, it would have been way, way too flat. So even though there wasn't a lot of purple or blue in these feathers, I ended up adding it in there just to get a little bit more richness in there and to get more depth. So these feathers are just like the feathers on the wings of the other bird, where I've blocked in where my dark areas go. I'm not going to line in each feather exactly like the reference photo. I just need it to follow the same pattern and have the same movement, and the feathers to be going in the same direction, be the same size, that sort of thing. And the hermit crab is moving around again. Sorry about that extra noise. So I've taken this reddish orange color and blocked it over the entire wing, taking that same color and adding some into the other bird as well. It was actually a color that I hadn't used on the other bird, but I wanted to make this red pop a little bit more. So I used more of that red than I had previously, and then pulled that red back into the other bird so they didn't look too different. But I felt that the brownish red color that I had in the other bird, it felt too flat to me. I wanted a brighter color. Blending that out with paint thinner. Again, make sure you have several layers before you bother blending, or it won't do you a whole lot of good. And while that dries, I work on the next area. Notice that I've left that lighter spot going down the center there, which creates the curve of the wing so that it doesn't look flat. Just like before, I'm taking that cream colored pencil with a Luminance and defining some of the feathers on that section of the wing, which has to be completely dry before it works. And I apparently turned the camera off and forgot to turn it back on. So we're going to skip part of that section. That wing isn't finished. I'm going to continuously have to go back over and do touch-ups until it's smooth enough and has the right amount of detail. That pencil should be way sharper than it is right now. That one's sharp. This is another section, like I was talking about before, where it just looks absolutely terrible for a really long time. You just have to keep working through it until it starts to look good. And it's easy to think at this stage that it will never look good. But don't give up. That line that I just put above the head is totally wrong. I'm going to have to come back through with an eraser and pull some of that out. It should not be so sharp there. That's where the head actually is, the line that I just put. So now I'm softening that up, and then I will blend out that incorrect line into the wing. I'm not sure what I was looking at that I thought that should curve up that way. I mean, there is a dark section there, but it shouldn't be that sharp. And we're at that crayon stage again. I have a lot of paint thinner on my brush at this point. Okay, so the section of the wing earlier that I thought I didn't record, I did. I apparently just stuck it in the wrong place. So we're going to skip down to that, or kind of backtrack a little bit. You can see I'm using that cream colored pencil and blocking in the feathers again. Paying very close attention to my reference photo. Not so much to make sure every feather is exact, but to make sure that they're all going in the right direction. The right size and the right movement. Now I'm coming through with brown in between some of these to get more of a mottled look. Because I don't want it to just look like random lines like they are now, just the outline there. So I've got to come through and add a lot of shading in between or in each of those feathers that I've drawn out. And I know I keep saying this, but I cannot stress it enough. Not all birds are going to have each feather outlined with the highlight of white like this. I'm using a much deeper red in between some of these feathers as well. Now we'll end up taking that red and using it on the other bird too. Okay, back to where we left off on the head and body. And I've had a lot of people ask me lately on when to know or how to know when to use the cool grays versus the warm grays versus the French grays. I don't actually overthink this. If I want a bluish gray, I use a cool gray. If I want a brownish gray, then I switch to the warm or the French gray. It's really, for me, as simple as that. And that just comes to looking at my reference photo and deciding, is that more brownish or is that more bluish? Now, if you have more paint thinner on your brush, you're more likely to see your brush strokes. So if you're trying to avoid having those brush strokes show, lessen up the amount of paint thinner that's on the brush. And you can do that two ways. One, just dabbing it on an old rag or a Viva paper towel. Regular paper towels do not work well with paint thinner. The Viva paper towel is very cloth-like, or like I said, an old t-shirt. The other way is just to, when you dip it in the paint thinner, let the brush set for a few minutes. Let it kind of dry out a bit before you touch the paper. So if you are having a problem with brush strokes showing, those are two easy solutions for you. While that dries, I'm working on the wing again, like I will many, many more times on this piece. And working off camera, because I'm a genius. Yep, still working off camera. I impress myself sometimes. You can see I'm layering the purples and the blues over the black so that the black isn't too flat. And I want to get this nice and dark so that when I come back through with the cream and white pencils, it'll show up really nicely. While that dries, I'm adding a little bit of yellow onto the wing and better defining some of the details. That white pencil looks like it's just a little nub, but it was sharpened on sandpaper, so the tip is actually fairly sharp. It just doesn't look like it. And working off camera again. It's at this point on the wing that I just start paying closer attention to the tiny little details. Like, it's mostly blocked out. I'm just adjusting my values for most of that. Now I can use the white and very sharp black to start better defining areas around the face and feathers around the head in general. You can see I'm taking the black and I'm coming in between some of the light areas that I put in there. Again, I'm paying very close attention to my reference photo as I draw these feathers in to make sure they're going in the right direction and that they are the right shape and size. And if you guys want to see close-ups of the birds' faces, the easiest way to do that, if you go over to my Fine Art America shop, I will put a link to that in the video description. You'll be able to zoom in and really see how much detail I actually ended up putting on these. It's kind of hard to see in the video and definitely hard to see on the photos that I've uploaded to Facebook because I can't post photos too large there or they get stolen. Well, they get stolen either way and people make prints out of those things, but I won't put high quality ones over there. So the best way to see that is just to use the Fine Art America thing. And I'm not telling you that so that you go shop. I'm just saying it has a nice zoom in feature over there so you can really see the faces. You can see it's starting to come out of the ugly stage, but it still has a very long ways to go. Now notice too my outer edge on the body and the wing really, how fuzzy it is. It is really important for me to go back through later on, and I'm not sure if I caught that on video, but I go back through and define that and sharpen up those edges. I do not want to leave those fuzzy. I'm taking a Luminance pencil and going right over all of the detail that I've done. You can still see what's underneath it because that pencil is so translucent. Now at this stage with these lighter pencils, I am adding a bit more pressure, so I'm getting closer to burnishing here. But without that pressure, they weren't sticking to the paper. Now, I am not done with the body or the other wing. I will come back and keep adding details as I go, but for now I am moving on to the next wing. Here I'm just getting a solid red color first, or that kind of pumpkin orange color. Layering yellow on top of it, and some brown, or it's that reddish brown color. I think that's that. I'm not going to say it right. It's like caput mortuum or mortuum caput, something weird like that. It's listed in the video description. I use that pencil a lot. I'm adding white on the few areas that I need to stay really, really white, because there are a couple of them on this wing. So the white luminance first, and then I will come back around and start drawing in the feathers, or the flight feathers. I guess all of this is technically feathers. Using the violet gray as my base on these. Going right over the black, because that black will still show up when I blend out with paint thinner. By blending over it, both the black and the violet, I do smudge the black a bit, but it doesn't really matter because I'm going to go back through and define it. Now notice the areas that I put the white, how when I went through with the paint thinner, the white just stands out so much. So I can go over it with other colors and it's okay. The white's pretty well protected once I blend out with paint thinner. Using a lot of blue and purple on this wing. Now that that dries, I can come through and start better defining the details. And again, I'm not at this point worrying so much about each feather being exact. I just have to follow the general movement of those feathers. Now the flight feathers, those ones I do get closer to exact, but these little ones, I just need to make sure that I'm going with the movement and the direction that the feather should go. This is another section. You can see that that outer edge is really fuzzy. I'm going to need to sharpen that up a lot before I'm finished. And to sharpen it up, I just go over it with another pencil to clean up that edge, and then a thin brush with paint thinner just to make that edge more crisp. It's easier to get those crisp edges with the Polychromos pencils than it is with the Luminance. The Luminance you can, you just have to depend more on your paint thinner to thin it out or to get the crisp line. With the Polychromos, because it's such a hard lead, they can easily get that line on their own. And just like the other wing, I'm going to layer on top of layer on top of layer until it gets the detail that I want. I don't think I've captured all of it on this feather. And really, for the rest of the birds, I did go back through once I stopped filming and just added teeny details all over the place. Just kept cleaning things up, kept layering until I smoothed everything out so that I didn't have any of that crayon look left anymore. If you like the crayon look, that's okay. I personally do not, and so I will layer and layer and layer until I've gotten rid of it all. And that is it for this piece. Let me know if you guys have any questions. It's going to be better if you leave the questions within Patreon because I'm making sure to get to you guys first before anybody else. So again, let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you guys next week.